Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I'm the founder and CEO of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization that is committed to nurturing a generation of men who won't buy sex. Today we have, as always, a very special guest. My friend Yasmin Vafa is the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls, a national human rights organization dedicated to protecting marginalized young women and girls in the United States. Yasmin's an award-winning human rights lawyer, advocate. Her work focuses on the intersection of race and gender and violence and law. As a nationally recognized expert on gender-based violence, Yasmin has successfully advocated for several laws at the federal and state level. She's testified before the U.S. Senate, state legislatures, and international human rights bodies. She's co-authored multiple reports detailing the overcriminalization of girls and young women of color, particularly survivors of sexual violence. Yasmin and her work have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, National Public Radio, and ABC News, and more. She serves on the U.S. Advisory Committee on the Sex Trafficking of Children and Youth and is adjunct faculty for the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges, where she leads the National Institute of Justice Domestic Child Sex Trafficking. In today's episode, Yasmin and I discuss gender inequality, violence against women and girls, and even child marriage in the United States. All of those things as part of a larger system of exploitation and inequality. And you might find the conversation shocking in some ways, but also maybe hopeful as we attempt to shed light on not just the problems, but some of the possible solutions. Yasmin herself is an immigrant. She's wise beyond her years, truly has the heart of an activist, and you're going to be both challenged and encouraged. This is your reminder that our conversation touches on sexual violence, and while it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma of this topic, we strive to speak truthfully about the damage being done. So thank you for joining us again as we explore more of the masculine wilderness.
In today's episode, we would like to highlight our partner organization, Rights for Girls. Rights for Girls works to change the narrative and policies that criminalize girls who have been impacted by gender-based violence. Rights for Girls advocates for solutions that provide girls and young women with access to safety, justice, and support. They do so by centering the voices and experiences of our most marginalized girls to ensure that their lives are not only contemplated in mainstream conversations around justice reform and gendered violence, but that their needs are made a priority. Learn more at rightsforgirls.org.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Tom Perez, and this is my friend Yasmin Vafa with Rights for Girls. I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit in just a second, but I was trying to think, and we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I was trying to think when was the first time that we actually met, and I think it happened during COVID. It's been a few years, but it's one of the unique experiences of this age in that you get to know people remotely. And then it's like years before you actually see them. And I think it was in Washington, D.C. where we met first. And you were larger than life on the Zoom screen because of your leadership and everything that you brought. And then you're like much smaller in real life. But I'm so glad you're here. I wanted you to just kind of start out by sharing with us, if you will, maybe just a little bit about like what you're doing now, and we'll circle back to that. But then like, how did you, like, what was your journey that got you into this work? Is very different from mine, very different from a lot of folks that we've talked with so far.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have this conversation. So Rights for Girls. Rights for Girls has been a real passion project for me, and just focusing an effort on girls in the United States and doing it from a human rights lens was very intentional for myself and our co-founders. And, the way that I came to this work was being an immigrant and being from Iran, issues relating to gender-based violence, human rights, women's rights, and girls' rights were always core to my upbringing and my sense of self. And so I was always very familiar with these issues, always very politicized from a young age, and always really familiar with the ways in which people in the West talk about the human rights of women and girls in other parts of the world, issues of gender-based violence, issues of women and girls' rights, and the ways in which we almost judge how places in the Middle East, in parts of Africa and Latin America treat women and girls. Being raised in the United States, going and being educated in the United States, and pursuing law in the United States, I was really kind of shocked by the ways in which the rights of women and girls, and particularly marginalized women and girls and young women of color in particular, were disrespected almost systematically here in the United States. And so I really wanted to focus my work on that. And so, connecting with other human rights activists, we wanted to focus our work across systems, across issues, and really highlight the intersections of gender-based violence and how it really restricts the rights, the potential, opportunities for girls and young women here in the United States, and frame it from a human rights perspective. And so because I can't go back to Iran, I can't work on these issues there, but I really do think that these issues are linked. And so for me, it was something that I felt really passionate about doing here. So that's just a little part of my journey, but something that really brought me to these issues here.
And how old were you when you came to the States?
I was about 5 or 6 years old. Yeah. So I was really young.
Okay. So all of your education, obviously, and training happened here in the States, and undergraduate, law school, all of that. So that happened. That wasn't just here, though, right? You studied in Australia?
Yeah, I did. Well? I did some of my studies in places like Australia, in places like Cape Town, South Africa. I did some comparative law there. I did some studies at Cambridge University in the UK. But for the most part, all really educated in the West. And so that's really been what's really framed my education and my upbringing. So it's been a really interesting perspective to hold, to have that, Eastern orientation, but also that Western upbringing in a lot of ways.
It's fascinating that you talk about having the, obviously the human rights lens. You see it as an immigrant as well. And it struck me when you were describing that. I am the son of a first generation immigrant myself. But he was, was a man, my father, and he was a physician. So that, there was obviously one step removed from the immigrant story other than my father's. But because I'm a guy, like hearing you describe it and how difficult it is and all of the challenges, and I don't want to get more into that in just a little bit. But anyway, it's just strange to my ears. But again, it's one of those reminders that I take a lot of things for granted as a man in this culture. Shifting gears just a little bit, you used the phrase a human rights lens. Practically speaking, what does that mean in terms of the work that you do?
Well, it means bringing a human rights framework to, how we approach the issues that we confront and that we work on. I think, that's not often how we address the issues and advocacy here from a domestic perspective. It means that we're guided by human rights principles, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right. Ultimately, we are influenced by those international law principles and those human rights principles that everyone has these inalienable, human rights and dignity. And that is really what guides us. And we really do feel that ultimately every human being, and girls and women in particular, have these rights, and that even in the United States, a country that really holds itself up as a beacon of freedom and liberty and dignity, can and does often deny its citizens, and particularly marginalized people, girls in particular, and girls from marginalized communities, their inalienable rights. And so we see that across many different issues. And we think that it's an important lens to bring to the work because ultimately it impacts so many different aspects of the work that we do. And it, just like in places like, the Middle East, just like in places like Latin America, gender-based violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking restrict girls' potential. They keep them from being able to achieve their full potential. It's no different. And, the rates of gender-based violence, sexual violence, child abuse in our country rival that of many developing countries. And so I think it's really important that we self-examine what's happening here and take a close look and, really hold ourselves to the same standards as we do other places.
How ready are we culturally, and I'm talking about American culture, like how ready are we for that level of self-examination?
I don't think we're ready at all. It's actually funny you say that because there was a delegation from UN Women that came to the United States several years ago to reflect on U.S. laws as they impact gender equality. And they did a really interesting assessment. And, one of their key reflections was that when they interviewed women in the United States, for the most part, many women thought that they had so many rights and freedoms here in the United States, more so than, so many other countries in the world. And they had no idea, for the most part, that we actually don't have a lot of rights as compared to many other countries in the West and in Europe, for example. And so it was very interesting. The women from that delegation went back and said, it's almost sad that a lot of women in the United States don't realize how restricted their rights are. And certainly in the last few years, those rights have been eroded even further. And so, it's almost like you don't even know what you don't know.
It sounds like almost like a frog in the kettle kind of a thing. Like, you were one of the first people that I heard, I listened to talking about this human rights lens as a way of framing the conversation around trafficking and, a lot of other things. It seems like if you can look at it that way, you can get away from the tendency to look at fighting sex trafficking, for example, as just some kind of moralistic crusade. Has that been your experience too? I mean, when you can get people to think human rights and think through that lens, do you get farther with people in terms of educating them and mobilizing them?
Well, certainly. I mean, we take different approaches with different, groups of people. And I think that's just, an aspect of advocacy. But certainly, I mean, I think, in human rights instruments, it talks very clearly about how things like sexual exploitation, prostitution, which are very closely intertwined with sex trafficking, are incompatible with the dignity and worth of, every person. And so I think, looking back to those human rights instruments and those, they really are guiding principles for us. And so we do, we've had meetings, for example, this came up in a meeting in Vermont, for example, with, the AG, and they were very moved by that. They were somebody who was actually very moved with the argument around human rights principles, and that resonated with them. And so absolutely, I mean, we come to these issues not from a moralistic perspective, not from, any other type of, judgment, but really from the fact that we believe that every girl and really every person has the right to live out their full potential without any fear of violence, exploitation, and, any of those obstacles and barriers. They really should have the opportunity to do that. Yeah.
But when I hear you say it that way, and made similar statements, it's like, that is a moral position. That is, using words like crusade, there's a whole bunch of baggage with that. That is a statement of moral value. It's just that it seems more accessible for people when you say that, no, it's a human rights thing. Sorry.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I don't think we should necessarily shy away from taking a moral position, right? I don't think, I think that's an important point. It's not that we should necessarily say that shy away from saying that, this is the right thing to do, right? And being on the right side of a cause, certainly like this is the right thing to do. And it is the moral and just cause, but more of the criticisms that we sometimes get around pearl clutching and, that's kind of what I am alluding to. So not coming.
Is there a masculine equivalent of pearl clutching?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I'm sure there is.
I don't know what.
To that extent.
Yeah, that's funny. I want to talk also, again, we can circle back to any of this, but I've been on your website several times. Ton of great information there, rightsforgirls.org, and it's rights number 4 girls. Anyway, we'll put that in the show notes, but let me pull it up here. I kind of went through this again recently. On the homepage, there were several startling statistics about the prevalence of gendered violence. And one of the things that I'm encountering, and Lauren, who is on our team and wrote a piece on our blog recently about this as well, just the sheer number of women that have been affected by gendered violence of all forms. It's startling to me as a man. And if you do the math, and I'm talking now to men, if you do the math on this, and if these statistics are anywhere near close to accurate, which I believe they are, we know people, intimately perhaps that have been a victim. Can you talk a little bit about just some of the research that undergirds those statistics? I think the one that's most haunting for me, is 1 in 3 women will suffer some form of, I think it's sexual violence in their lifetime.
Yeah.
And like, I have 3 daughters, and so anyway, can you unpack some of that? Was that your research? Is that stuff that's been known for a long time in the domestic violence sector?
Yeah. So a lot of those stats come directly from the CDC.
Okay.
And in fact, in the last couple of years, they've even updated their stats with respect to teenage girls. And I would urge folks to take a look at those most recent stats with respect to sexual violence experienced by teen girls post-pandemic, because they have found just really alarming statistics about, forced sexual encounters amongst teen girls, and some of the most alarming statistics around teen girls that they've found in the last decade. But typically, it's much more common than you would think. And, what we often say is, when you're sitting in a group, when we're doing a meeting, it's likely you're in a room with a survivor of sexual violence, child abuse, domestic violence, family violence. It's very pervasive in our society. And so it is likely that you know someone. Yeah. It is likely that you've interacted with someone. And, I think it's really important that people keep that in mind, navigate situations with that knowledge. And, I think that it just speaks to how pervasive gender-based violence is in our community and in our culture. It's deeply entrenched. When we talk about gender-based violence, we're talking about very often male violence against women and girls, but it can also be against, children, LGBTQ, gender expansive, young people, boys as well, but often male violence, right? And so, we definitely need to reckon with that as a culture and as a society. A lot of the research that we have done as an organization has really drilled down on the fact that although gender-based violence is incredibly pervasive and cuts across all boundaries of race and class and ethnicity, when girls with economic and family stability experience violence, they are often more readily able to access the services and support to get on a path to healing. But when marginalized girls, girls who are, marginalized by race, ethnicity, disability, immigration status, for example, when they experience violence, they often are not recognized as, child victims of abuse. And too often because they are marginalized, they have to fend for themselves.
Yeah.
And so their coping mechanisms to cope with the trauma that they've experienced are too often punished, and in the worst cases, criminalized. And so we first came to realize this from talking with young girls all across the country, girls who had experienced juvenile justice involvement. And, at first we started to think, like, is this just a couple of bad jurisdictions, or is this part of a larger pattern? And unfortunately, we found that it was a pattern.
Wow.
And so we put together this report in 2015 called The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, The Girl's Story. And we really wanted to name this troubling trajectory where girls, and mostly girls of color, were being pushed into the juvenile justice system as a direct result of the abuse that they suffer. Girls who were in foster care, who were suffering abuse, who were then running away to escape that abuse, would face being arrested for the status offense of running away.
Right.
Or, a young girl who was being trafficked, who was missing school, could be arrested for the status offense of truancy or for the prostitution offense, even though she's too young to consent to sex.
And so once that happens, then they're in that pipeline.
Exactly. And so, it becomes very difficult once you're disconnected from school, from your community, from your family, to really escape that cycle of victimization, incarceration. It becomes very difficult because the system itself is traumatizing for any child.
Yeah.
But thinking about what that system does and the conditions of confinement do for survivors of sexual abuse and trauma, conditions of confinement like solitary, strip searches, use of restraints, all of those things are really harmful to survivors of abuse. And so, we really started to shed light on this phenomenon. And then last year, we wanted to revisit this issue, post Me Too, post Black Lives Matter, post pandemic. Is this still happening? Yeah. We've done all this wonderful justice reform. We've had this huge racial justice, reckoning as a nation, and the Me Too movement has happened, and we found it's still happening. And in fact, girls are getting pushed into the adult justice system, the adult legal system for much more serious crimes. So we found, for example, sex trafficked girls are being punished for forced criminality. So girls who are being forced by their traffickers to commit more serious felonies. So either recruitment, trafficking, kidnapping, money laundering, and they're being pushed into the adult system. Girls like Centoya Brown, Piper Lewis, Crystal Kaiser, who are defending themselves against their adult abusers and being tried and sentenced as adults. And some of them, sentenced to 20 years, if not life in prison. And then the third pathway we uncovered were girls who are brave enough to report being sexually abused, but disbelieved by law enforcement and charged for false reporting.
Wow.
So that was the third pathway that we really wanted to highlight as an urgent call to action. And so, these are still happening. And so for us, we really wanted to highlight these girls who fall at the intersection of gender-based violence and criminalization, and highlight that, not only are they suffering, but they're being, it's like the worst form of victim blaming. They're being punished and then criminalized for being victims.
Yeah, it's like metastasized victim blaming. Right. It becomes part of the system. Right. That scenario parallels what we saw at Epic during that same period, those same really momentous things. We saw the market of sex buying essentially undisturbed through that whole thing. So the biggest question in my mind is, do you have any sense of why, with all of the reckoning, like you say, why has it not changed?
You think with respect to sex buying?
No, I'm talking more with
just
this issue. The wider gender-based violence, with all of those cultural things that have happened to us collectively in the last few years, and we're still in kind of the same spot, if I'm reading between the lines.
Because I think it says a lot about who in our culture gets to be seen and treated as a victim, and who gets to be seen and treated as a child. And I, think that the sexism that women experience and the racism that Black and brown women experience, gets pushed on to young girls. And I think that, the combination of those factors is amplified for, young girls and young girls of color. They have this intersecting, obstacles of age. So their credibility is impacted by their young age, their race, and their gender. And so all of these kind of compete to make them, less valued and less credible. We call it in our report
and less seen, like
right? And we call it the credibility discount in our report. But a lot of it also, there's this report that when we talk about it in our report as well, it's called adultification bias. There's this notion that especially Black girls and Black boys as well. I mean, it was the research was based on Black boys, that there's this notion that they are seen as older, more mature, less deserving of nurturing and care. They're seen as less innocent than their white counterparts. And so that translates to girls as well. And especially when you talk about issues of things like sexual abuse, they're already seen as more, promiscuous, more knowledgeable about things like sex from a younger age, from age as young as 5, the research shows. And so when they experience things like child sexual abuse, they're almost seen as complicit in their own abuse.
Even though they might be the same age as a white victim.
Exactly.
What did you call it? The
adultification bias. So they're adultified is, the language of, the research. And so, there is evidence to show those biases come into play from a very young age and from adult actors that they come into, encounter in the various systems that they encounter, through the course of them coming to court or law enforcement or schools. And so all of this, comes into play. And so, it's really something that we've seen throughout the course of our work. And I think it impacts all aspects.
Did you see similar outcomes in that research with Indigenous women and girls?
Yeah. So our report looked at African-American, Indigenous, and Latina girls and Asian girls in this most recent report. And yes, we found very similar factors. And in fact, Indigenous girls face very high rates of incarceration and bias. Absolutely.
Yeah. The whole idea of not being seen, what I was saying earlier, just hearing that through a man's ears, that's such I'd say fascinating. It's a troubling thing.
Right.
I go through my day and I know when I need to be seen, I'll be seen, and just like it's so ingrained in, just who we are as men. But to hear that, it's really troubling. I wanted to just loop back partially, because I think there's some dots that we need to connect in this conversation, and it's about sex trafficking, and you're using the general term gendered violence. My question is this: is sex trafficking a unique kind of crime, or is it part of a broader continuum of violence that's inflicted on vulnerable people by people with power? Like, can you? Especially with men, conversations that I have with men, they want to see trafficking as, we got to get those bad guys, right? Yeah. And I call it the action hero impulse, But can you talk a little bit about that? Are we talking about two different things or the same thing at different points along a continuum?
I think that's a great way to frame it. So, we certainly talk about our work in terms of addressing gender-based violence. And sex trafficking, in our view, is a form of gender-based violence, an egregious form of sexual violence. And for us, it's very important when we do our work to first explain what sex trafficking is, and I think for us, we always ground it in understanding, of the federal law, which explains that, sex trafficking occurs anytime an individual is engaged in a commercial sex act, right? But when we're talking about the crime of sex trafficking, it occurs when an adult is induced to perform a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion, and that's the crime of sex trafficking, or when a minor is involved in the commercial sex trade, and that's anyone under the age of 18.
And you don't have to meet those criteria.
Correct, right? There does not need to be any showing of force, fraud, or coercion. Just the mere involvement of a minor in the commercial sex trade is sufficient to show sex trafficking. And that doesn't just need to be through, the system of prostitution. It could be any commercial sex act. So a child who's found in stripping or in pornography or, any other type of commercial sex trade is sufficient to show child sex trafficking under the federal definitions. And so that is, really important. There doesn't need to be a third party exploiter, right? Sometimes people talk about it in terms of survival sex, a child who is engaging, in the exchange of sex for basic necessities, food, shelter, any type of basic necessity with an adult, that's still child sex trafficking under the law. Yeah. So it's really important to understand how broad that designation can be. Really what's important to understand, in recent years, people have talked a lot about the differences between prostitution and sex trafficking. And of course, there are legal distinctions. But practically speaking, in our work, survivors transcend the line between the two, very often, many times between the course of a week, a month, right. Can even be in a few days, So practically speaking, the line between the two is much more blurry. And so, when we're talking about adults, of course, anytime a child is involved, it's always child sex trafficking. Yeah. And so, I think it's important when we're talking about sex trafficking to understand that it's happening in the same ecosystem as prostitution. Mm-hmm. So, put another way, sex trafficking might be the means, but prostitution is the ultimate end. Yeah. And so sex buyers can't meaningfully, discern whether the people that they are soliciting are trafficked or not, are consenting or not. It's all happening in the same ecosystem. It's not like there's a sex trafficking trade and a prostitution
trade.
Well,
and our experience in directly talking with active sex buyers, like a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them really don't care the source.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They don't ask. And, to quote a survivor, buyers don't care. They don't check our IDs. Like they don't even care if we're of age.
Right.
They're just, many cases opportunists, in many cases thrilled if you're younger, so they don't really care. Right. And so it's important to realize that it's all happening in the same ecosystem of the commercial sex trade. And so, the other important factor is, that often the adults in the sex industry were first entering the industry when they were minors. So most of the survivors and individuals that I've now met and worked with first entered the sex trade when they were minors. I'd say upwards of 95% of them. Wow. And so technically under the law, they were child sex trafficking victims. So even if they come of age in the industry, it blurs the line once again, and makes it very difficult to say, like, is this prostitution? Is this, still a trafficking victim? So again, the lines are very blurry. And ultimately, it's a very, serious form of sexual violence.
And so that's, I wanted to come back to that. So what's the connection then between sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, and other, like, what are the threads that connect those things, other forms of gendered violence, sexual violence?
For us, how we've heard survivors describe the dynamics of sex trafficking is very similar to other forms of gender-based violence. For example, domestic violence, where the dynamics between the trafficker and even the sex buyer, the power and control dynamics can be very similar. So, for example, people will describe their experiences with their trafficker or their exploiter or, their pimp, if, that's the terminology that they use, will be very similar to that of someone in a domestic violence relationship who has, been either groomed for a long period of time in that relationship, that has an emotional or traumatic bond with that partner, an abusive partner. Yeah. So oftentimes the dynamics can be very similar and coercive.
And it's all built on that power differential, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It can be, similarly coercive, like that person is in control of their finances. They could, share a child with that person. They could, share a domicile with that person. That person could hold their, legal documents. Very similar dynamics where, that person has the power over their movements, their phone. Mm-hmm. So very similar dynamics. Where it's really hard to, remove yourself from that relationship and from that dynamic, both physically and emotionally. Yeah. A lot of times survivors in trafficking situations will describe the isolation that their trafficker put them through, very similar to how, abusive partners will isolate their victims from family, from friends, from their community. So there's very similar dynamics in many ways. Another very similar dynamic is oftentimes when you talk to survivors of DV, when they're in the relationship, they will say that, they want to stay in that relationship. They don't want to any accountability for their abusive partner. They don't want to, have a restraining order or any type of, take any type of action. But if that same person is able to leave that relationship with support, they might have a very different take on that relationship years down the line. Yeah. Similarly, with sex trafficking survivors and even survivors of prostitution, they will similarly say, when they're in the relationship or in that dynamic, that, they want to be in it, that it's their, choice, that, everything's okay, that this is a relationship, this is their boyfriend, or this is their husband, or whatever the dynamic may be. Potentially, if they're able to have the support to leave that relationship and the services to be able to exit, they often have a very different perspective on that dynamic.
But they can't see it when they're right up against it. Yeah.
The trauma bonds are very similar. Again, they're not identical, but there's very similar process of trauma and bonding that takes place.
Well, the other similarity that I'm hearing as you're explaining this is the common denominator is men. Most often, not exclusively.
Most often, right.
But it's men with power.
Always, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's similar to, it can also be, women in like a family violence situation, right? And the dynamics, again, will mirror that of like an abusive family violence situation. A family member, like a familial trafficking situation, can mirror that of like a family violence situation where a mother or grandmother is trafficking a child or, a family member. And that can be, a mirror, a trafficking situation where, a woman is trafficking an individual. That certainly happens too. But again, it would be similar to a family violence situation like that.
So it's a little bit hypothetical, but my next question is related to this. So what happens in terms of like the cultural narrative or policy or the criminal justice system? What happens when we insist that trafficking is a unique form of, crime, like when we zero in on that to the exclusion of this broader kind of a conversation? What do you see happening? And maybe just take one of those, like in terms of like the broader cultural understanding of the issue. What's the cost of seeing trafficking so narrowly that way?
I mean, I think that's been one of the problems. I mean, I think people are so shocked by, the notion of sex trafficking and some of the more, egregious scenarios and that we've heard that are just absolutely shocking to the conscience and unbelievable and horrific. But I think, the focus on the most extreme forms of sex trafficking can really blind us to the much more common everyday forms of, sexual exploitation and, sexual violence that really are on the spectrum.
Yeah.
Like you said, and I think, there are so many forms of sexual abuse, sexual violence that really are on the pathway to, before people are sex trafficked, there's often so many different forms of trauma that they experience before falling victim to sex trafficking that I think, to focus on sex trafficking, we've missed so many different intervention opportunities. Along the way. We're talking about foster care. So many of these kids have been in foster care. So many of these kids have had red flags at school. Like they're, when you talk to these survivors, even the children, they talk about so many red flags that were missed, instance after instance that were missed by so many different adults, so many different people who were entrusted with their care, that they found themselves in these, impossible situations. And so to wait and zero in on sex trafficking and wait for the most egregious, sensationalist story, is really just to miss so many critical intervention opportunities and prevention opportunities.
I was just going to say that because as I'm listening to this, hearing you break this down as a man, the other thing that we are missing, there's intervention opportunities, but we're also missing opportunities to do a better job of how we're raising the boys that become men and the boys that become buyers. And I know partly my own experience, but other men that I've talked to, is it kind of lulls us into a complacency as men, because if all this is, like you talk about the most egregious examples of this that require, I always go back to the Liam Neeson, that require a unique set of skills. Well, as a man, I don't do that. So I'm off the hook, right? Right. I can't go into the jungle and, shoot the bad guy and rescue the poor kid. So it breeds complacency and I would argue complicity on the part of men that otherwise might have something to offer. We miss opportunities for intervention. We miss opportunities for prevention when we zero in on sex trafficking as something that's unique and isolated and all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Or something that's happening in just like big cities or, happening to certain communities. And certainly, I think after COVID, we really learned. And right now with just online exposure, becoming more readily accessible to more and more communities, we're just seeing that traffickers are becoming more sophisticated at recruitment methods. And, certainly kids are becoming more sophisticated at online access and just online exposure. And, Congress is dragging its heels in terms of regulating. And, the tech companies are making it very difficult for us to pass all of these really important pieces of legislation that would, finally put forward some regulations. And as of now, it's very unregulated and it's very easy and we know, we have the data, we see, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children consistently reports like the millions of tips they get to their cyber tip line, tens of millions of reports they get to their cyber tip line. Online enticement reports have skyrocketed and, it's really important.
That's a big city problem, right? That just happens in big cities.
Right? No, and that's what's so crazy. I mean, I think the New York Times did this excellent investigative report just a few years ago that just found like this overwhelming, I think every parent and just everyone should read that because I think people have a false sense of these issues. They don't have a real sense of how bad it is and how concerning it really is. And how this abuse is happening of, tens of thousands of children in real time. And we're just talking about the kids, know, and I think it's really important to just get a handle on what's happening. And, as you said, like what our role is as a society and as concerned individuals in our society. And certainly, folks that are, really care. I have, people coming to me every once in a while, like, they know I'm Iranian and they know I, care about issues of human rights. And they'll say like, I'm really concerned about child marriage in Iran and Afghanistan. And like, what can I do? on that. And I'll say, thank you for your concern about child marriage in Iran and Afghanistan. But, and this was, last year. And I was like, but, this person was from Virginia. I said, what would be great is if you can help us pass a law to end child marriage in Virginia, because between, the last several years, we've had almost 8,000 child marriages in Virginia, and almost all of them have been between girls and much older men.
Wow.
And it would be great if you could help us pass that law right here in Virginia. Because guess what? A lot of these issues are happening right here in the US. And it was eye-opening for me as an Iranian American woman to realize, oh, this stuff's happening here. Like, I don't have to go to Iran or work on these issues for Iranian women. I can work on these issues here because we have a lot of issues right here. And there's a lot of girls in our community that are waiting for us to help them. We have a responsibility, in my view, to really improve and live up to the reputation that we hold for ourselves.
That's such an insane reality that's like hiding in plain sight. Like you said earlier,
we
want to see.
And they're not immigrant girls, right? Some of them are. These are American girls whose parents are, in many cases, marrying them off to much older men. Yeah. They're in, some of them are in religious sects. Some of them are rape victims. I mean, it's exactly what you would think is like happening in Egypt.
Is happening here.
These other countries, these marital rape laws, they're like truly marrying their children to their adult rapists. And there's so many brave survivors who are speaking out. There was a woman who lobbied, Michigan. She wore a wedding dress with the names of like 5,000 survivors of child marriage and went to, the Michigan State House and helped get that law passed, after it had failed several sessions. And, I'm happy to say our partners got the child marriage law signed here in Virginia just last week. And so, it's very possible, but, there's no shortage of advocacy that we need to do for our girls here.
Right here. Yeah. Do you know how many other states that is still an issue?
So we've passed laws to end child marriage in 12 states in the U.S. Only 12. 38 to go.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's a secret that's hidden in plain sight. And like, for me, it's not unlike, like I've had many conversations with people about, all the fear over open borders and people, people being trafficked into this country. And I'm like, and I know that we know that happens. But what I've started to say to people in response to that is, well, they're coming here because American men will buy them. And we don't want to talk about that. Like, we don't want to talk about child marriage. Wow. So you're saying 12 and there's still 38 to go. Like there's nothing on the books that could prevent it?
Well, it's some varying degrees, but basically the 12 states make the minimum age 18 with no exceptions. Okay. And so that's 12 states have passed laws to that effect, and 38 basically have less protections than that. And generally speaking, usually they don't have a law.
Wow. Well,
so basically, typically speaking, your parent can just allow you to get married at any, often I think it's, 16, but in some states it can be younger.
Wow. Two of my three daughters go kicking and screaming. I didn't want them to get married.
I know.
And they were in their mid to late 20s when it happened. But man, that is staggering.
I mean, it's very easy to look at other countries and say, they're so backwards. Like, let's do something about Afghanistan. Yeah. And I was just, again, as like a Middle Eastern woman, it was just very, and I was as polite as possible, but just saying like, fix your own backyard. Yeah. You know what I mean? We have our own problems here in Virginia, and, we can do a lot here. We can get our churches, we can get our, local community groups involved in advocating for change here. And if we're not comfortable doing that, we need to ask ourselves why we're so comfortable advocating and judging other countries, and we're not ready to do that here.
It feels like kind of a proxy justice effort. If we can do it somewhere else, we're good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Because I think our girls are just as worthy, of advocating for.
There's a novel idea.
You would think that, we would be ready to fight just as hard for our girls here. Yeah. They certainly are deserving, and, asking us to.
Yeah. Yeah. That is just staggering. And I love you do this so consistently. You talk about our girls. I mean, I know that's your heart. I'm asking you to make a generalization here, but how different is the world, the day-to-day lived experience of our world? How different is it for girls versus boys? Like, what are some of the things? And we don't have to talk about necessarily girls that are, victims or at risk of being victimized, but just in general, you look out your window at a schoolyard and you see, girls and boys running around. Yeah. How different is it for each group?
I look at my daughter now and she's 5. And I think when they're young, it's pretty similar. I don't think, some of that socialization, it does happen young. And I start to see some of that. And certainly I think, they do get those social cues and those gendered norms they seep in quickly. Yeah. And I do think when they're young, it's fairly similar. They experience the world, I think, similarly. I think as they start to get older and perceive the way that they are viewed by people in society, and I will say men, I think is when that starts to shift.
Yeah.
And and this is, again, my daughter's still young, and, I will speak to my experience. When you start to perceive yourself being viewed and objectified, that is when you start to feel and navigate the world differently.
Yeah.
And I think that is when girls start to experience the world. And again, we're speaking in generalizations because I do think, certain experiences for certain children are going to be different. Sure. But on the whole, I think once girls start to be perceived by men and sexualized by men and perceived and objectified by men, is when they start to feel unsafe. Yeah. And that is what hinders that's what changes how they navigate. That's when things change for boys and girls, I think.
Do you have, because you are not nearly as old as me, do you have memory of that point in your own life?
I think so. Yeah. I think for me, it was probably 11 or something like that. Yeah. 10 or 11.
Yeah.
And then you start to notice how people look at you and look at you a little bit different. And then it starts to make you feel unsafe. And then, you have to navigate. Things are a little bit different.
Yeah.
And then I think you have to tread a little bit more lightly. And I think that's when, and I don't know what moment it is. And then you start having conversations with your family a little bit differently. And then you start having talks about how you're dressed and, what person to go around and that person you shouldn't go around and avoid that individual, or, the conversations you start to have that make you confused as a child and that you later realize. But I think then from that point onward, you start to navigate life differently, right? And I think that safety factor is what I think is the biggest difference. For girls and for women, you never feel 100% safe. And I don't know, I think other women would agree, but you're always watching your back, everywhere you go, everywhere you go, you never feel 100% safe.
Yeah.
You're always watching where you're going. You're always aware of your surroundings. So I think that's the biggest difference. And I think that's a fundamental, injustice, and I think that the mental energy it takes to always be thinking like that hypervigilance of always being aware, it takes something away, right? Because I think of the free spirit, happiness and, happy-go-lucky vibe that kids have when they're really young, and then something shifts to you feeling that vulnerability that's just embedded and that you're just always conscious of it. And there's so many layers to that. I think when you think of the cultural considerations, right? Thinking of whether you're an immigrant family or if you're in a religious family or in certain cultures, the shame and stigma that you have to carry if something happens to you, God forbid, if you are violated, what that means, or, what I mean? All of the things that you carry. So there's so many layers to it, but I think that becomes the fundamental difference. How at some age, girls and, boys on the whole shift in terms of girls realize that they're vulnerable because of the fact that male violence is incredibly pervasive.
Well, and hearing you describe this, I'm not so old that I can't remember back, that same point in my life as a young man, while you were experiencing those things. I can only speak to my experience, but I don't think it's that unusual. While you were experiencing those safety breaches and the things that made you look over your shoulder, I was experiencing power for the first time and agency. And, like it's almost the complete opposite. Not that my life was free of fear, but I had fear and power. Mm-hmm. And that's a different trajectory for a person, and I had fear and agency. I had fear and, physical strength and presence and all of those things. So it's so different. And we're talking girls and boys, not victims of trafficking or even gendered violence. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just the reality. I mean, I know I've had conversations like this with friends over the years of, men just being shocked that like when women walk home, they have their keys in their hand, and like, or that they always have pepper spray, just things like that men are like shocked by. Yeah. Like my husband recently was asking, do they sell pepper spray anymore? I'm like, what do you mean? Of course they still sell. Of course. He's like, you never hear about that. I'm like, you don't hear about that. Of course they still sell pepper spray. What do you mean? It's just funny, like things like that, where it's just not a reality. Yeah. But at the same time, I know I've talked to him and others where, men who I think are more conscious of these dynamics, they are very intentional about how they interact with women, and especially, age dynamics, power dynamics, and are very, I think, for example, of like Keanu Reeves, who's always every photo he takes, he's very careful not to touch the women next to him. He always has his hands like this. I think people who have power or are very aware of their stature or standing, who are, very intentional. I think that's important too. I think there are men and certain individuals and, it's who are aware of those dynamics and who, understand those dynamics and are very, I think it's just important this day and age to just be mindful of all of it,
Yeah. So different. Couple more questions for you, kind of go together, but what is one of the most harmful trends you see in our culture currently? And the other side of that is, what is a hopeful trend that you see just culturally?
Harmful. Oh, there's...
I know there's a lot on that list.
I'm very pessimistic these days, Tom. You're catching me.
All right. Well, if you don't...
many things. No, but I will be, let's see. Well...
You've kind of hinted at a bunch of them.
Narrow it down to just one harmful trend. Well, the big thing we've been working on these days is this, growing mobilization around, full decriminalization of prostitution or what people call decriminalizing sex work. We've seen this under the guise of like progressive policy and, wanting to protect marginalized communities and, Black and brown communities. Folks really feel like decriminalizing the sex trade is the way to go. And so, I think this comes down to some folks who are very well-intentioned, who really feel like this has been a very carceral society and we've just over-criminalized in so many different areas, and this is one of them. And, they just need to course correct and decriminalize all aspects of the sex industry. And this is the way to go. Yeah. Unfortunately, what a lot of people don't realize is that these policies seek to decriminalize all aspects of the sex industry, including pimping, sex buying, and brothels, which, the combination of which expands the sex industry by driving up the demand and, increasing sex trafficking and, just talking with survivors and, people who serve this community, they are, horrified by the prospect of this. And, we have examples from other countries that it's been a disaster. So that is a very concerning, harmful trend that we're seeing. There was a hearing on a bill in Rhode Island 2 weeks ago. There's, events in Illinois on this. And
do you know off the top of your head how many states this legislative season have something, just like a ballpark number of states?
This season has not been that bad. I'd say probably off the top of my head, maybe three states.
3 states that are considering this kind of legislation.
Yeah.
Okay.
This session.
Okay.
So not too many. And I don't think it's really going anywhere in those states.
Okay.
But, there's been a big push and there's a lot of money behind it. And people forget that the sex trade is a multi-billion dollar industry, right? We're talking like big tech or big tobacco. Like people forget it's an industry with lobbyists and, PR, and it's a force to be reckoned with. So it's very difficult. And it's, an industry that's on the verge of becoming legitimized and interested in becoming legal and legitimized.
Yeah.
And so, it's been very challenging to combat that. So I think that's a really harmful trend because there's a lot of good and well-intentioned folks kind of buying into some of their talking points and their philosophies. And, you really have to break it down and explain, the supply and demand dynamics and why it doesn't make sense and how it would increase sex trafficking of vulnerable people. And so that's been really challenging and labor intensive. And also very difficult for survivors. It's really, really been hard on the survivors we work with.
Yeah. I have seen in that community a kind of a pervasive weariness over this particular issue.
Yeah.
So let me let you off the hook slightly for the second part of the question. Like you are in the thick of it. You are on the front lines. You're seeing stuff that, most of us don't see. And, what for you, what do you do regularly that is life-giving for you? I know you're chasing kids around. There's part of it, but is there something unique that's your thing? Yeah.
Well, I'm a big plant and flower person. So that is very life-giving for me. I try to, get out in nature and enjoy as much as I can. I love all of that. I'm just a big plant person. And that's just really my joy. But, I do think there are so many things there are things that give me hope. I don't want to pretend like there aren't. I think for me, the young people we work with are just always, I don't know why it still surprises. It shouldn't surprise me, but I'm still so blown away. Like yesterday, I heard from another mentee of mine who, is just brilliant, that she just got into Georgetown master's program for public policy, and she got a full scholarship, and she's just amazing. And she's so bright and so talented. And, it's just the young people really continue to blow me away and give me so much hope and optimism. They're just...
Amen. I feel the same.
That's what keeps me going. Yeah. It's just every time I feel jaded and I talk to our crew, we're just, overwhelmed and grumpy, and, it's just, I get an email like that and I get a call from someone for telling me something incredible, and or I hear them give testimony that they wrote that's just mind blowing. And it's just, just re-grounds you in why you do this. And, it's just, they give me hope because, that's why we do it. That's why we do it. And, they're always reminding me that, that's who we're accountable to. And that's why we do this,
Yeah. Yeah. My dad was a pediatrician, and when our kids were little, we're calling them all the time for every little sniffle and bump and scrape. And hearing you talk about kids, and I feel the same way. I hear my dad, because he would always say, you know what? They're really tough.
Yeah.
They're really resilient. Mm-hmm. And it's not just true of, kids with strep throat. It's 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. So I'm really glad to hear that. Last question for you, if you will indulge me. This is a podcast called The Masculine Wilderness. We're trying to broaden the conversation among men about how to show up in the world as a man in a way that brings life. What is your advice, encouragement, admonishment, however you want to serve it up. What is your last word to men?
When I talk to groups and I, talk about, for example, sex buying or objectification of women, or hypersexualization, I sometimes use this example of a bunch of men who are there for a bachelor party. And, there's this one guy who insists on going to the strip club, but all the other guys just want to stay at the bar and drink. But, that one guy insists. And so everyone else ends up going along with it, but no one else really wanted to go. They all just wanted to drink, but they all just indulged the one guy. And every time I tell that story, without fail, at least one person comes up to me afterwards and says, that happened to me. And that always happens. And, I didn't want to go, but without fail, every time I tell that story, a guy will come up to me and say, that happened. And I just feel like men need to be aware that there are so many more of those guys than the one guy who wants to go to the strip club, that engages in sex buying, that, engages in that type of objectifying, sexualizing behavior. And I really do think we need to encourage men to be more open and have conversations with each other. And just, I don't know, I think men need to be liberated amongst themselves. I just think we need to encourage men to just be more empathetic and emotional and have these conversations and have more friends. I just feel like they need to talk more amongst themselves about these issues. When I talk about all of this, I talk about how most men aren't sex buyers. Most men don't do it. But the minority who do are very good at convincing our society that it's really common and that most men do it and you should be
everybody's
socially acceptable doing it. That's just not true. And I think if the majority spoke up more and talked about how it's not socially acceptable and it ought not to be socially acceptable because it's damaging to not just the woman, to society, but to the man himself, and to, families and our community. And, I just think it would benefit that man himself. I just feel like people as a whole, you could tell every time that those men come up to me afterwards that they're just really wanting to have that conversation. And I'm sure I'm the last person they want to have that conversation with, but I think there needs to be more opportunity for men to have those types of conversations. And I just encourage them to, be more open and emotional and empathetic. I think the world would be a much better place if men, especially American men, could exercise more empathy. That would be my advice and my hope, because I think truly the world would be a better place if American men could be more empathetic.
Yasmin Vafa, you are wise beyond your years, I would say, and you're a blessing. So I appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for everything you do.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.